Hi guys, I'm Corey Waters, and this is the TVAN PAN series. TVAN is Temple Vegan Action Network, and PAN is Peace Advocacy Network. If you're interested in joining either, touch base with me after the event. The TVAN PAN series is a film speaker series, and this is our 5th event since October. I call it a series because I want for people to realize that there's always more to come. At the moment, I am planning several events for the 2013-2014 academic year. You can be informed of these events in multiple venues. One such venue is Facebook. You can join the TVAN Facebook group. You can like the PAN Facebook page. You can also like the Animal Activists of Philly Facebook page. You can also just friend request me if you really want to. I don't have a lot of friends, so I'm always happy to get new friends. Another venue is meetup.com. You can join the PAN meetup group, and you can also join the Animal Activists of Philly meetup group. So again, that's Facebook and meetup, TVAN, PAN, Animal Activists of Philly, or Corey Waters. As for tonight, I am very excited to have someone of this caliber here with us. This is Dr. Kim Socha. Socha?
Socha.
Socha? That was the other word I wanted to pronounce. You saw me looking at the page too, and I didn't know. Kim Socha. Kim has a PhD in English. She is the author of Woman, Destruction in the Avant-Garde, A Paradigm for Animal Liberation, which was released by Rodopi in 2011. She's published on topics such as Latina literature, surrealism, critical animal studies, and composition pedagogy. And she is a Minneapolis-based English instructor and an activist for animal liberation and social justice causes. And what I admire most about Kim and scholars like her is that she utilizes her research and her knowledge production to advance not just her career, but social justice more broadly. And I know as a budding sociologist, I'm striving to do the same. So, as for tonight, how it's going to work is this. Kim is going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then she's going to facilitate a discussion for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to sell some books. The books cost $28. That is a discounted price. All proceeds from these sales will go to animal advocacy groups. I must also acknowledge that we have samples of pizza. That pizza comes from Blackbird Pizza. I think everyone may already be aware of this, but I have to mention it anyway in case someone is not aware of this. But Blackbird Pizza is a vegan pizzeria located on 6th Street, 6th and South. And these samples tonight were funded by Veg Fund. Veg Fund has now funded 4 consecutive series events, so I'm grateful to Veg Fund for their continued support. And of course, thank you to Gina and Wooden Shoe for hosting this event. All right, Kim.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stand so people can hear me better. Maybe I'll bring this over to kind of use it as a podium. I'm a little sick, so I feel like I'm congested, and I want people to hear all of my pearls of wisdom that I'm going to impart to you. So I want to thank Temple Vegan Action Network, the Peace Advocacy Network, who I had the pleasure of meeting, or 2 volunteers at the AR conference this year in Washington, which just ended, and also Wooden Shoe Books for having me speak, and of course Corey for getting this started. He just kind of randomly said, any chance anyone's coming to Philadelphia? And I'm like, well, I happen to be from Philadelphia, so I was excited to have the chance to talk about the book. This is the 3rd reading of 4 Confronting Animal Exploitation critical essays on liberation and veganism. And but this is the first time that I've actually spoken about it for any extended period of time. For the most part, I've tried to make and I'm going to explain why a little later, how this book came about. It's been very important to me and my co-editor and author in the book, who I'll talk about, Sarah Jane Blum, to make the authors of the book kind of the center of attraction when we've had readings, and I'll explain why in a bit. So what I want to do first is kind of, I know what some people, just a few people, I know what your ideologies and perspectives are, but I want to kind of situate how I see the animal liberation movement in contemporary culture. And I want to do that by starting with a recent protest after the Critical Animal Studies Conference. It was a foie gras protest instituted by the Animal Rights Coalition in Minneapolis. I sit on the board. And this protest in some ways was very standard. It was great because it was right after the ICAST conference, so we got a lot of people to come out. And we got some of the standard responses. If anyone's ever done, I do other kinds of social justice work, as Corey had mentioned. I work in juvenile detention facilities. I'm on the board of Minnesota Normal, which is to reform marijuana laws.
Woo!
Yes, thank you. Which to me means just make it legal, and I don't like the idea of reform too much, which I'll get into a little bit. So at this protest, I want to specifically focus on animal rights protests because I think in some ways it is a little different than other types of protesting you might do. So we got some support, some people were honking as they went by. They didn't even know what we were protesting. They just saw people protesting and they liked the idea, which was awesome. We had people join us, which was amazing. A couple came by with their baby, and they picked up signs and joined the protest when they found out about foie gras production, which, if people don't know, is force-feeding geese to the point that their livers become diseased, and then they slaughter them and charge a lot of money for it in bougie restaurants. So we got people who didn't know about it and just joined us in the movement, which was an amazing experience. And then we got the other kind of typical comments, get a job, get a life. There are people who are hurting. There are people who are starving. So I kind of want to start with, again, positioning the animal liberation movement. And if those people had actually, and there weren't many of them, but if those people had slowed down long enough to actually have a conversation, because usually when people say things like this, they run by, because they have no interest in a dialogue. They're just angry because they can't imagine why would you focus your time on issues of animal liberation. As most people know, issues of let's just focus on animal agriculture, of course, affect the environment, the global poor. I mean, these are things that there's no time to talk about. But I also thought about something else. So what I want to start out with is basically saying what I would like a chance to, even though so many of you probably know this, what I would want to say to people who do those kind of drive-by or walk-by comments. So still to this day in 2013, animal liberation activists are somewhat seen as jokes or laughable, or aren't you cute, or aren't you silly that you're wasting your time on these issues when there are so many more important issues. So to the people who don't care or don't get it, I would like to talk to them about two, I'll call them entities who do get it, and that would be the U.S. government and corporate America. Some might argue that they're one entity. Some might argue that we live in a plutocracy, which is, of course, a government run by corporations, and I think a good argument could be made for that. So I imagine myself, if these people had stopped sitting down and explaining, well, you may think this is unimportant, or you may think this is a joke, but this is important enough to the corporations and to the government that they're so scared that they're labeling animal rights activists, or animal liberation is a term I prefer, as terrorists. So there's the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which people are aware of. So if you kind of think of, I don't want to put it as a hierarchy, but we have animal liberation activists here, the U.S. government and corporations here, and this whole big group in the middle who just don't get what's going on. Maybe because it doesn't get enough press, or they don't see the value in it. So, but something has the government and corporate America scared enough to develop special bills to target animal rights and liberation activists. The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act says that if you do anything that gets in the way of an animal enterprise, which means any company that's making its money off of non-human animals, which is a lot of them, you can go to jail as a terrorist. There are also the ag-gag bills, which people are probably aware of, where the animal agriculture industry is so scared about having people just see images of how their food is made, that they will put you in jail just for taking an image of how these products are produced. So that's what I would want to say to these people. The people who are creating your food are so scared of you seeing what goes on that they're actively promoting bills that can jail people for taking videos or taking pictures. And this happened recently. People might know a woman named Amy Meyer was on a public street, just like you could be, and you could not even care about animals at all. But you see a factory farm or a slaughterhouse, and she happened to take video footage of downer cows, meaning cows who simply can't move anymore, being pushed along a gravelly road or a path with a bulldozer. And again, she's on a public street. She took videos with her phone and was arrested. So that's kind of the world that we live in. And that should be scary to everybody, whether you care about animals or don't care about animals. Luckily, thanks to especially one activist and writer named Will Potter, enough attention was brought to this that the charges were dropped against Amy Meyer. But again, similar issues can certainly occur. What I would also say is this might not matter to you and this might not be a serious issue, but here's who does care about it, other than the U.S. government and corporate America. The Center for Constitutional Rights, who is not an animal rights group, cares about this issue enough to say it's a violation of First Amendment rights. I was lucky enough to co-edit this book with Sarah Jane Blum, who is part of a lawsuit against the government, protesting the constitutionality of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. They threw out but it's on appeal now, so they threw out the grievance basically. But Sarah Jane and Ryan Shapiro and her other cohorts are continuing to sue the government over this issue. I would also want to tell those people that the American Civil Liberties Union, who, again, not an animal rights group, are explaining that this is a breach of constitutional rights. It is unfairly stigmatizing a certain group of activists. So if you're, I don't mean to make it sound as if people who aren't doing Occupy movement protests and other types aren't being targeted and repressed as well. But there is no other law that specifically targets people who are concerned about environmental and animal liberation. So again, that's something I would say to people who would laugh at this issue. Just as some examples, again, many people probably know the #1 domestic terrorist threat in the nation is who or what? That's a question I throw out to the audience.
Underground activists?
Yes.
Certain...
The Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front. #1 domestic terrorists. Foreign terrorists, we think of Al-Qaeda. Like, this is the best the government has to offer. I was at a protest during World Liberation for Laboratory Animals Week. Just 13 people, all different ages, standing peacefully in front of Wuxi Aptec, named the most painful lab in the country. And, you know, we were told by security, you're welcome to be here. They were very nice and accommodating. And then another activist and I had just gone around. It was in an industrial park, really quiet, and we happened to find not 1, not 2, but 3 police officers. So this tells you how little is going on in Mendota Heights or St. Paul, Minnesota. They needed 3 police officers to secretly watch us, I'm not saying I'm repressed. I know people who have gone through a lot more, which I'll get to as well. But this is the state of the movement. So I would want those people walking by, or to use Voltairine de Cleyre's words, which is fitting for an anarchist bookstore, sneering in their sleeves. I would like them to know that this is the reality of being an animal liberation activist. If you, let's imagine there's a fur store. If you burn down a fur store because you're greedy and you want insurance money, you might get a fine. and you might get a little bit of jail time. If you burn down a fur store on principle because you think it represents violence and exploitation, you will get pegged as a terrorist, and you may get 10, 20, or 30 years in jail. So ethics, not okay. Greed, you'll get maybe a slap on the wrist. This is the state that we're in. I also want to mention, I didn't really want to do this because it's not my essay, but there's a chapter in this book by Aaron Zellhofer, who was part of the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty campaign. His partner, Kevin Jonas, who they both live in Minneapolis, went to jail for almost a decade for running a website that posted public information. This should scare everybody, again, whether you care about animals or not. So this is something Aaron has to say. Robert Stevens produces dog fighting videos. His audience most likely had no problem watching images of animals in pain. The Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in support of his producing these videos. Commenting on the case, Wendy Kaminer of The Atlantic poses the perfect question here when considering who gets to document animal cruelty. Shouldn't people, this is Wendy Kaminer's quote from The Atlantic, shouldn't people who oppose animal cruelty enjoy the same constitutional rights as people who enjoy it? And that's such an important question. And this is, again, I feel this need to mention that these are people who are not animal rights activists. They're people who are saying their civil liberties are being trampled, and a certain group of activists are being targeted by, again, a plutocratic government. So that's something to keep in mind. That should, because it could be, you know, whatever. I always hope that people either care about other humans, the environment, or non-human animals. Because no matter which you claim to care about, the animal agriculture industry is destroying all of them. It's leading to starvation for 40,000 people a year. I'm not laughing at that statistic. It's something my dad and I have talked about because I had the number way off when I was going over things. 40,000 people a year die of starvation in the world, and over 70% of the land on this planet is used to grow grains and crops meant to feed animals to be slaughtered so that people from wealthy nations can eat them. So do you care about humans? As far as the environment goes, the United Nations, again, not an animal rights group, really doesn't care much about it, has said the #1 threat to environmental, or the #1 cause of environmental destruction, probably most people here know this, is the animal agriculture industry. More so than if you got all forms of transportation, you'd have to multiply it by 40% to do as much damage, because people don't want to give up meat and dairy. So that's the other thing I would like to say. What do you care about? Humans, the environment, non-human animals. I happen to care about all three. No matter what you care about, go vegan, would be my answer. So that's how I position the animal liberation movement as a serious political issue. Not a fringe movement, not a joke, not something that guilty white people with too much time on their hands do when there's nothing else to be done on a weekend. This is serious and it's widespread. So that's the nice thing I would like to say to that woman. I might have said something else that isn't very productive, but sometimes in the moment my censor button goes off. But I think with her I just yelled at her to read a history book. That's all I said. And again, I am fairly new to the movement. I have been blessed to meet, in a very secular sense. My next book is about atheism and animal liberation, so I mean that in a secular way. I've been blessed to meet activists who have been in this movement for a really long time, some of whom have given up again up to a decade of their life. Specifically, the person I'm thinking of, again, for running a website. Did absolutely nothing illegal, but the government created a law to make that illegal. So now I want to talk about this book. and then I want to talk a little bit about why I think it's special. Corey had mentioned I wrote another book, and I think that book is special, but I think this one is more special. And it actually springs from, again, being fairly new to the movement, and being, I mean, when I say fairly new, being vegan for only about 4 years, and meeting people who were welcoming, who have been vegan so much longer. I would hear a lot about this animal rights conference, the big one that happens every year, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So talking to local activists, they would say like, oh, I'm sick of this animal rights conference that happens every year. The same people are saying the same thing. They're canned speeches. So I asked, why do you bother going then? And the answer I got was, because I enjoy the hallway conversations that happen when I meet activists from around the country and really around the world. So that was actually the initial book, Hallway Conversations, but the publisher had other ideas. So now it's the name of the intro. And so I kind of looked around and said, so why are the same people always saying the same things when maybe more radical messages are being watered down or censored? And I'm going to get to one issue that I think is censored from that conference. So again, looking around at my group of people, I said, well, why not offer these activists, these street-level, rank-and-file activists who do the day-to-day work and never get a chance to explain why they do it or how they do it or why it's meaningful to them? What if we gave them an opportunity to say something? And that's how this book was created. It was a very different book when it started. It was a completely abolitionist, not in the Gary Francione style of abolitionism type of book, but it morphed because I realized all of us don't, believe it or not, all of us don't think alike. We don't share a brain. We have different ideas. So, and there are people in this book who just reject the term abolitionism. They think there's, and rightfully so, racial implications in that that terminology that shouldn't be used. So, both Sarah Jane and I have a history in publishing. Again, Sarah Jane, a long history in the movement. So we decided to make a platform, and that's what this book is. And you know, while I hope you buy copies, I also hope that it inspires activists to say that, you know, the people who wrote this book didn't think they were writers, thought that they had nothing to say that anybody cared about, but we wound up with, I think, a beautiful collection. Some are research-based, some are narratives, but they're written by people who are struggling with the day-to-day activities, you know. The people who don't get to talk at the national conferences get to have their say in this book. So I want to just briefly talk about my two chapters, but I want to focus on one. One of the chapters is about the dreaded comparisons, where there's a trend, a kind of a long trend in the animal liberation movement to use analogies of slavery, genocide, and Holocaust to expose the plight of non-human animals, and it's kind of an argument about the limits of doing that, how they can be productive, and when they just shouldn't be used at all, because again, that's to ignore the reality, I think, because most of the people who, I'm thinking of PETA, most of the people who make these arguments don't have much sense or don't care at all really about Native American genocide or the Holocaust or slavery. They're just borrowing analogies, and I think that it ultimately fails. But that's not the chapter I want to focus on. There's two chapters in here, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm an anarchist bookstore. That would interest people. One, which I didn't write, is by Travis Elise, called Anti-Capitalism and Abolitionism. And then mine is called Just Tell the Truth, a polemic on the value of radical activism. And how I want to tie this back into the Animal Rights Conference is there was a debate. Two luminaries of the movement, and Patrice Jones, who wrote the afterword, was there rallying against the fact that there were two white men speaking and debating the issue again. It was Bruce Friedrich of Farm Sanctuary and Gary Francione. Everyone knows Uncle Gary, as I like to call him, although he's not my uncle. But what I found they both made good points. They both made valid points. So do we just stick with, no regulation, don't fight for regulation, which I tend to agree with more. It's only going to perpetuate the problem. And then we have Bruce Friedrich saying, regulate, make things better until we ultimately liberate non-human animals. So there's total abolition, and here I am using the word, and then there's steps on the way to abolition. And again, both of them made good points, but what neither of them critiqued, which was very frustrating for me, neither of them critiqued capitalism. And I don't understand why there's such a refusal, maybe because we all enjoy it and benefit from it so much. I know I do. But why is there this refusal to critique capitalism? And that's something that I thought was sorely missing. So again, if you buy the book or find some kind of PDF that's floating around the internet or whatever, please definitely read Travis Elise's chapter on anti-capitalism. He specifically deals with Francione. So I just wanted to read a little bit from the book about my chapter, which critiques and ponders why capitalism isn't more commonly on the agenda. I mean, so I want to actually start with a quote from Alexander Berkman. Yes, will be known by in an anarchist bookstore. So he said this in the early 20th century, which I think is just as true today as it was when he wrote it. This is a quote, and he says this about big business. They will see to it that no legislation is passed against their interests. Now and then they will make a show of fighting certain laws and favoring others, else the game would lose interest for you. But whatever laws there be, the masters will take care that they shouldn't hurt their business, and their well-paid lawyers know how to turn every law to the benefit of the big interests, as daily experience proves, end quote. So I continue applying this to the an argument against reform in the animal liberation movement. Now and then the animal industrial complex, I'm using Berkman's words, will make a show of improving, reforming animals' lives so that advocates feel they are still in the game. However, in the end, big business will do nothing that will hurt their business, and their business is killing animals. So that's something that I felt both of these, again, luminaries and very famous people in the movement are refusing to address. That's never on the agenda. Just to talk a little bit more about why I think this is such an issue, I want to give a case study, again, which people might be aware of. About 5 years ago, Smithfield Foods reported that they would phase out gestation stalls or crates. So these are, again, crates where you put a pig and the pig can't even turn around. So basically living lives of physical and mental torture. And they promised to phase them out for more what they called animal-friendly group housing pens. So in response to this, the Humane Society and PETA said we have to emulate Smithfield. Bruce Friedrich said kudos to Smithfield for doing it, whatever their reasons. So someone who claims to care about animals said, oh, I don't care why you're doing it. You're going to give the pigs a few more inches, so kudos to you. There's a long history of the big movements, or the big groups, PETA, Mercy for Animals, Compassion Over Killing, writing love letters to corporations because they're, again, agreeing to add a few more inches in which non-human animals can suffer physical and psychological torment. So just to read a little bit, they have not changed, meaning Smithfield has not changed their product line, and sloughing off the reasons for Smithfield's decision is a specious choice. PETA reports that within the United States alone, 65 million pigs are captive on factory farms, and 112 million pigs are killed each year worldwide. Smithfield's industry contributes to this gruesome statistic. The pig industry generates its products exclusively to slaughter them for human consumption. Smithfield's pledge to phase out gestation crates is not a promise to lessen the number of pigs slaughtered. Just the opposite. As a profit-making entity, their objective is always to make more profit, and this means selling more pigs' body parts. Their public relations scheme, disguised as a humane resolution, helps consumers feel better about eating pig products, for the pigs they are living in lived in animal-friendly environments before slaughter. In truth, however, and every activist knows this, there is nothing remotely animal-friendly about Smithfield Foods, and their use of that deceitful terminology would be laughable if it was not so lamentable. And again, this is something that Gary Francione argues, but again, no critique of capitalism, and I don't see how that's possible. When animal proxies bargain on animals' behalves, they are giving power to animal exploiters to determine what constitutes acceptable use. As Bob Torres, I'm sure you have his book here, Making a Killing, social anarchist, the political economy of animal rights, he puts it really well. HSUS and PETA make Faustian bargains with industry that condemn animals to maintain their status as property and commodities of a bloody capitalist machine. So when animal welfare is the issue, there's always going to be experts called in to determine what constitutes fair use. Richard Haynes says, in relation to animal research, as he defines it, alleged experts are either the same people that use animals in research or that are employed by institutions who have a major financial interest in using animals for research. The most chilling application of this logic is apparent in the standard conclusion of experts, and this is a quote, that death does not count as harmful to the interest of animals, nor prolonged life a benefit. To repeat, experts on animal welfare have determined that death is not harmful to animals' interests. Smithfield would agree, but people who care about animals should not, which is again why I argue against the reformist approach to eventual abolition, because I think all it's going to do is result in people feeling better about eating animal products. Maybe not the most mind-blowing idea, but again, I keep repeating, I wish there, in the mainstream movement, I wish there was more of a capitalist critique about these issues. So just a couple more, a few more things I wanted to read in this capitalist critique of really not just the animal industries, but about the movement itself. Despite our differing perspectives, animal advocates of all kinds contend against oppression, making it imperative that we consider all aspects of a species as culture, and that includes the economy. In the U.S., this means, and again I'm quoting Torres, and if you haven't read Making a Killing, I hope that you will. We're going to need to fight the heart of the economic order that drives the oppressions. We're going to have to fight capitalism. I can't imagine my little niece got bored by this. It's amazing. Capitalism is so that was, now we're getting to my words again. Capitalism is an innately tyrannical system through which parity, this is by definition, is not possible. It is built upon a slave-master dichotomy with the bulk of a nation's resources in the hands of a moneyed few. If animals will not be liberated through the industries that exploit them via reforms and laws, as I argue in the rest of the chapter, they will not be liberated by a corporate ideology that exchanges impossible ideals for money. And this comes after a critique of, people might be familiar with Skinny Bitch, the Skinny Bitch series, which basically tells women to be vegan because, and this is their words, you're fat, ugly pigs. So they basically vilify pigs in the book to make women feel bad enough about themselves to go vegan while they're making pigs sound like they're creatures who are worthy of no sympathy or compassion at all. That's the best that the mainstream groups have to offer. But I believe that, and I have this is a fear as well, that the animal liberation movement's radical political message could easily be marketed away if veganism becomes, or some might say remains, a Euro-American bourgeois lifestyle choice. And this is really important, I believe. In the rise of critical animal studies, the polemical figure Steve Best, people know about Steve Best too. Whatever you think of him, he has some interesting things to say. He admonishes leftists for refusing to acknowledge animal exploitation as a serious social concern, while also asserting that animal rights activists, and this is somewhat fair, are seen as politically naive and single issue, currently incapable of seeing, much less articulating, the connection between animal exploitation and global capitalism. While not arguing that the free market invented speciesism, which is maybe as old as when humans first began to engage in agriculture, Best sees it as exponentially ramping up the destruction of people, animals, and nature. It cannot be humanized, civilized, or green-friendly. Rather, it needs to be transcended through revolution on all levels. And I know that there's something, if someone wants to talk to me afterwards, if there's any anarcho-capitalists in the room, I still haven't been able to wrap my mind around that. So maybe you can help me see the light if there's any of you here. Veganism is more than just a food alternative, or as it is more commonly seen, as a list of food prohibitions that lead to malnourished bodies and neurological disorders. It's a protest against domination, exploitation, and oppression. Again, of humans, of the environment, and of non-human animals. So when veganism, and we're seeing this happen, I'm sure maybe it's, in a way it's pleasing, in a way it's upsetting. So veganism is becoming a part of the commodity system. And capitalism is giving us things that are enjoyable, because that's what capitalism does. It's giving us cookbooks, diet books, pleather, faux fur, cheese, mock meat, and t-shirts and bumper stickers that declare our veganism to passersby. Yet although these are things that I and others may enjoy, they are human indulgences available only to those with the financial means to buy them. So there's also a danger, if it hasn't already happened, of veganism being becoming a classist issue, and we could, of course, we know it already is, as is so-called humane farming, which is an oxymoron, of course. Meanwhile, if all goes as planned, and I cite statistics earlier, meat consumption is going to rise exponentially. So even though there seems like there's more vegans, usually because you hang around with vegans and it seems like the world is vegan, but in reality, meat consumption is growing, especially, and this is why, unindustrialized countries want to mirror America's mass consumption of cheap food model. As evident as the benefits of commodity veganism are for me, market-based economies do not encourage emancipation for animals. The truth is, and this is a quote, people might be familiar with Brian Dominick, who wrote, who coined the term veganarchy. Anyone familiar with that? It's a good pamphlet, it's free, it's available online, although he's not vegan anymore, which makes me sad. But this was, I'm still going to quote him because we can always hope that people will come back. The truth is that capitalism will always give us more cages. And until we destroy the social machine that produces those cages, the closest we can expect to come to liberation is momentary and relative freedom. End quote. But many of us want something more. We want enduring, absolute animal liberation, and this will not help without considering alternatives to reform rights and corporate dogma. Again, these are all the things that are being used to draw attention to and to liberate animals. So I kind of end the chapter not with a specific answer, but a search for what those alternatives might be. And I think that comes, if there was one way I could kind of summarize it, it would be thinking about the differences between reform and revolution, and just a couple things I always like to say to people who think they understand what veganism is. There might be some vegans who think that they're beyond the cycle of life and death, but the actual original definition of veganism by Donald Watson. I always want to say Paul Watson, but it's a different Watson. Is that as much as is practically possible. So, veganism is not a claim of perfection. It's trying to eliminate oppression and cruelty as much as possible. And when I talk about revolution, I don't mean doing what? I don't know, getting thousands of people together to, maybe one of the worst things we could do would to be open all of the factory farm doors. Because what would we do with all of these non-humans who we've genetically modified, that some of them can't even stand up on their own because we've just messed with them so much. I think revolution is a process. Thinking about something like the October Revolution didn't actually start in October in Russia. It started a long time before that. There was a February Revolution, but it was a long process. So when I speak about revolution, that's specifically what I'm referring to. And with that, I will end my talk. Thank you for listening.
Why do you think there is such a lack of a critique of capitalism and animal rights discourse?
I don't want to make sweeping generalizations about, let's say, the big names in the animal rights movement, because they're such critical thinkers. They're brilliant people. I mean, Gary Francione is a very critical thinker, but I think I would say it comes down to a lack of critical thinking, a sense of maybe not wanting to give up or acknowledge. For example, another chapter I wrote kind of caused me to have to interrogate my privilege as a white person, and I think it comes down to not wanting to look at how we all benefit from capitalism, because it opens up so many doors that are very difficult to deal with. I think it further complicates in some way, but it also makes to me it makes clear what we need to do. But I think it just seems like a further complication. Why add another wrinkle to something that is already so messy? Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, old friend. Well, I appreciate your wanting to take on the 500-pound gorilla in the room, or 5,000-pound gorilla in the room. I mean, I studied a little bit about capitalism in school and everything else. But don't you think population is more important than capitalism when it comes to these issues?
Absolutely. Population growth is a major issue. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking of a conference I just went to, and you would have enjoyed it. There was a debate. It's available online somewhere. If people want to email me, I could find it for you, where there was a debate about vegan childbirth. So should vegans be reproducing? And what Dr. Carol Glasser was arguing with a scholar named Kirby Pringle, basically saying that it's a really good argument, that as animal activists we're always saying adopt, don't create a need for new animals by going to pet stores and things of that nature. If you want to have children, let's give homes to the children who already exist, and there needs to be a none of this is going to be from some greater authority telling people what to do with their reproductive systems, but more of a thought of, will you make a conscious decision not to reproduce until we can just don't buy a dog or a cat, let's phase out the breeding industry. So I think population very much factors into issues of animal liberation. When I talk about world hunger, that's a part of it as well. I think that in the United States, capitalism, as far as animal liberation goes, is an issue that is more at the forefront, but I agree that we should consider issues of population. When it has been brought up, others in the movement, which surprised me, have raised the specter of eugenics, as if I don't know any animal liberation activist. I know many who have chosen not to have children who want to foster any kind of form of eugenics, but I think it's an important issue, and it deals with the idea of world hunger as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to share a couple of local stories that kind of play into your plutocracy that you were talking about in the beginning. So, in full disclosure, I am the campaign director for Peace Advocacy Network. But a few years ago, I was arrested in front of the Whole Foods right up here just for handing out vegan leaflets on the sidewalk.
Wow.
And the ACLU thought it was a big enough deal that we ended up fighting the city of Philadelphia, who ultimately withdrew the charge and paid me a $15,000 settlement. But we also protest the horse-drawn carriages. And there wasn't a big problem with any other type of protest, but when we showed up, suddenly we needed a permit, which the compendium did say we needed it. We ended up fighting them in federal court, and we won. So now you don't need a permit to be at the Park Service there. And also, Peace Advocacy Network was listed as a moderate terrorist threat for handing out veggie burgers to little kids. So.
Yes, and I really thank you for sharing that, because it really is those, not that you're inane, but it's those inane stories that you would be labeled a terrorist. I have...
Right, and we were never labeled, well, at the end, that one we were labeled a terrorist, but the first two were strictly First Amendment, but it was like anybody else could have done it, and it wasn't brought up as an issue until the animal rights people were there, and then all of a sudden we were silenced.
Absolutely. I work with a local group. They've been around for 30 years, and you know we have a little vegan boutique, and the FBI has come in, and we just kind of were shocked. You know, there's true stories of the FBI attending vegan potlucks, and again at the AR conference, Ryan Shapiro, who was part of the lawsuit for the ATA, just made an amusing comment that if you want to pay an FBI agent to come and watch a bunch of vegans eat, you know, that's a waste of taxpayer. Just like the 3 police officers who had to come out to a peaceful protest. If nothing else, and there's a wonderful new group or campaign called the White Coat Waste Project, if people are aware of it, where they are basically trying to draw attention to issues of animal experimentation by looking at issues of taxes. Like, is this really what do you want your taxpayer money going to addicting primates to cocaine when there are tons of, you know, removing any social issues that come with drug addiction as well. So these are all things that I think, if there's one interesting trend that I see, and I think what you bring up is effective, is when you're advocating is bringing up the absurdity, which is what I try to do, is like that basically any of us here, maybe a few of us here would be considered domestic terrorist threats. And the people I know who have gone to jail as terrorists, it's absurd. Because when people think of the word terrorist, they think of planes flying into buildings, not vegan potlucks or giving out veggie burgers. But that is yes, I'm glad you're laughing, because that is the reality of what we're dealing with. Yes?
I would just say also the notion of like all that kind of that idea of terrorist is also fucked up and racist. You know what I mean? Because you already have these like racist assumptions put up in one society. But I would say that like obviously anyone that threatens capitalism in a large way, be it by not consuming animals, by not wanting to exploit animals, obviously is going to be perceived as a threat to the system because it undermines the system. You know what I mean? So it's not really that absurd that, you know, animal rights activists are bunched in with this, like in what the challenges are.
Yeah, I think it's not absurd to activists, and it's not absurd to the government, but it's kind of when I was talking in the beginning about that big group of people in the middle, like when they hear it, they almost, because no one that I've ever met is afraid of animal rights activists. Even the so-called, you know, the ones who are really in the forefront, which would be like the Animal Liberation Front, have, again, there's never been a record of any person or animal being harmed, even when they've done rescues. But you're right. We can see it. And I think, though, the reaction to others is a sense of how absurd it could be in other ways. I think your hands.
When I ask about vegan diet, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think there tends to be a tendency to not critique industrial agriculture. For example, the amount of soy that's in vegan diets, and the fact that most of that is genetically modified, the huge implications that has on the environment and on animals, because animals are fed GMO corn and soy. So I know there are vegans who eat local, sustainable food, eat organic, but why is that not more present in the movement as a whole?
That's a really good question. It's about this idea of why aren't, I'm fond of saying, but not popular for saying amongst my friends, like veganism is not going to save the world. Because even if the world went vegan, there's still issues of monoculture. What would wind up happening, like let's say the whole world tomorrow went vegan, you would just have these same corporations creating these products. You mentioned genetically modified foods as well. You also have the issue of, so I might say something like world hunger. We could be using this land to feed people, let's say there are people starving in America. But let's say we want to say what we think of when we think of starving children would be maybe an ad we see on TV. There are so many other systems you have to get through, like who's going to allow that food into that country, and is that food actually going to reach the people? These are very complex. A lot of the foods that people eat, I don't know why this came to mind, but like Lara bars are raw vegan bars, but they were bought by General Mills. Cliff bars, which a lot of people, I know I used to eat a lot of, but they won't say where they source their chocolate from. So now I'm like, I gotta take Cliff bars off the list. And while other companies will be very open. So I think that's an important point. And I think why there's a hesitancy to acknowledge it is because we don't know I personally don't know the answer. But I think it's important when you advocate not to make these grand proclamations that veganism is going to save the planet and all can eat. There's all these other systems that we have to get through. So thank you for mentioning that. Oh, yes.
Oh, I also think it's a similar answer to what I would say is why we don't critique capitalism, is if you're looking at it from a marketing perspective, you want to try to pull in as much people to your message as possible. And so the more nuanced you make it, the less palatable it becomes to most people. So Francione said, veganism is a moral baseline, and we have to critique capitalism. And his audience and his point becomes more and more far-reaching for most people.
Yeah,
So.
and you make me think of like the big organizations like PETA and HSUS. They want people to give them money.
Mm-hmm.
If they started, that's a perfect example. If they started critiquing capitalism,
It's not smart.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
not. It is a business.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I recommend Bob Torres, Making a Killing, where he discusses how the animal rights and liberation movement has become corporatized, and why another reason they won't critique it is because they are it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
A couple of comments. Well, a quick comment. I think the veganism as a diet is overemphasized. I think for me, it's not hurting animals. I don't have a good diet. I drink Mountain Dew and potato chips. That's my breakfast. I'm more concerned about the harm than it's done to the animals. But the comments I wanted to make, your book on atheism struck a chord, being an atheist. I think that one of the forces that doesn't get looked at is religion. And what I mean by that is, Christianity has heaven, there's nirvana, there's paradise, there's all of these concepts about the earth being dirty, foul, it's supposed to pass away, it's supposed to be destroyed. And so you don't have an investment. You're always going off to heaven. One other comment about that, As a homosexual, I'm used to having the Bible quoted to me, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. But I've also had people quote Genesis, dominion over the earth, dominion over animals. So I think there's this religious factor that is an obstruction to moving forward in regards to animals and certainly other areas. The other quick comment is that I've been a social justice activist for about 35 years. So I've encountered anti-nuke people, anti-war people, radical peace people, immigrant people, labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even those who are into permaculture. And I've talked to them about this connection, and I've used terms like witnessing against animal exploitation, boycotting meat as I would boycott yellow grapes, using analogies like that. And I find that I could count the number of vegans on half a hand, on all the leftist activists involved in social justice issues. Animal rights, animal liberation is still way over here. One other comment about that, I talked to someone about a year ago. We were talking about the environment, and the conversation was about overpopulation. And I said that human population needs to be controlled. There needs to be a halt to it. And I'm thinking of, the encroachment on the Amazon. And I was called a racist.
Yeah, and that's the problem I had mentioned when it's brought up, a eugenicist or a racist, because when you look at overpopulation, a lot of times you're not talking about the Western world. But, to tie that back into the religion, you also have, let's say, the influence of, for example, the Catholic Church in Africa telling people not to use contraceptives and things of that nature. So again, it could tie back into, which is my next project, and you made some great points as well about how religion influences it.
Can I say something about the last conversation?
Of course, people can talk to each other.
Yeah. I'm not a vegan either, but I'm trying real hard right now, But don't you think that atheism is sort of an overzealous ideology? And, and when it comes to population, I think that's a sacred subject. That's what we should be sacred about not extincting ourselves. It's not about eugenics or any of this other baloney. It's about common sense and not extincting ourselves. We're way too successful as a species. Forget about all of these fancy terms. I don't even know what eugenics means, but I know it's trouble, for somebody who really cares about the species, because it creates an intellectual conversation and we're all going to go to hell thinking that we're smart. I'm talking about hell in a handbasket, not the Catholic hell. I'm trying to recover from being a Catholic myself.
I saw someone's hand in the back. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, just in terms of population being like a sacred subject. Feminists have been talking about this for years, right? Like in terms of the state control of our bodies, forcing us to produce children for a capitalist model to create workers within the capitalist system. So I think that when we begin to have these conversations amongst ourselves about women trying to get reproductive rights for ourselves all over the world, then we'll be making those choices as whether we produce or not.
No, that's a really good point, is bringing up the feminist perspective, and that exists, of course, in any other patriarchal culture in the country where there isn't a lot of choice whether or not you reproduce. As far as atheists being zealots, I wish there were more atheist zealots. A term that I guess is commonly used is apatheism, apathetic atheism. I know many people like that who just are like, I don't think there's a God, I don't care if there's a God. I think of atheism as a political issue, and I think as much as, you know, we claim a separation between church and state, I wish more atheists would be vocal about and not be as accepting of that refusal to separate church and state. You know, something as simple as, you know, the 10 Commandments. I have this conversation with my dad a lot. He's over there in the ALF t-shirt, which I bought him. You know, this idea of, well, why do atheists care? And it gets back to, and you know, I'm not here to plug a book that isn't even finished yet, but this idea that, you know, religion is one thing you can never take away from at least the religions I'm going to look at, which is almost all of them. There are some religions that are kinder to animals, is this idea of hierarchy. And if you're familiar with the work of Murray Bookchin, I keep mentioning anarchist writers because I'm a student of an unofficial student. I just read a lot of anarchist writing where, you know, he discusses, and then Bob Torres, who brought it into the issue of animal rights, like, these come down to issues of hierarchy. You can't disengage that from religion. The only religions that have been somewhat kinder, though certainly not, none argue for animal emancipation in a broad sense, would be indigenous religions and Wicca, who are at least willing to acknowledge human animality, where atheists, and that's part of the book as well, atheists will acknowledge, well, yes, human are animals, but they don't acknowledge the implications of that or what it might mean as far as what do we owe other animals then. Was there?
I just want to say, actually, our understanding of atheism comes from Jainism. So it's like, you know, there are religions, although they wouldn't be deemed as religions, it's more a spiritual way of life. But Jainism, classical Buddhism, and classical Hinduism all advocate pure vegetarian diets, which is what veganism was until people started co-opting it, and then
I agree. My critique of Jainism is that it's very hierarchical. They actually have taxonomies of groups who matter more than others, and their idea of the greatest birth you can have is a human birth.
that's in Hinduism. It's more in Hinduism. I mean, we can talk about that.
Yeah. No, Jainism specifically does, does have specific levels, let's say like land dwelling, like maybe cows are a higher level. It's actually a very hierarchical, they do advocate not eating at, like some will actually wear, people might know this already, they might wear veils so they don't inhale microbes, they'll walk with a brush, but a lot of it is about this idea of karma and reaching a higher spiritual state. My goal, or what I want, is for people to see that animals matter whether or not they can get you to that higher state.
But it's also about practicing complete stuff, which is complete non-violence, and basically minimizing your impact on the world and realizing that we're all things.
No, I agree that that's how they look at it, but I still think it's based in speciesism and hierarchy.
I'm curious with this new book you're doing, because from what I've read, it seems like there has been some work done on intersections between religious ideology and animal rights discourse, like the book Dominion and so forth. But so you're taking a different tact in looking at the secular dimensions of animal rights or animal liberation?
Yeah, what's interesting, or there's never been any official study done, but there's been enough information, I won't get into citing sources or anything, showing that people in the animal liberation movement the majority identify as either atheist or agnostic. You know, Gary Francione said it, so we know it's true. It was in, a small study was done in the 80s, and then a recent study, I don't know the details, came out of a university, just saying that people who are atheist or agnostic are more apt to be sensitive to animal issues and to be animal rights advocates. So there's this kind of proof that there's this and I know it's purely anecdotal, but most people I know are also atheist or agnostic. But if you look at the books, there's a ton of books on religion and animal liberation. And there's not one, I mean, many writers like Peter Singer, and we don't want to get into him, who are atheists, okay, but they don't make that direct connection.
Right.
So I kind of thought, well, what this seems like, and again, I think it gets to that apatheism, where so many people are like, yeah, I don't believe in God, who cares? And that's why I want more zealotry in the atheist. And also, look, reading works of secularism, just there are little bits and pieces here and there. If you read Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, I mean, it's like, the title says it all. He has a whole chapter, a whole section about pigs and how pigs have fared. I don't say he actually cared about pigs. I don't think he was vegan or even vegetarian. Bertrand Russell, who was also problematic because he was anti-Semitic, but he said, like, about Jesus Christ, you know, putting, taking demons and putting them into swine and having the swine go drown themselves into the ocean. I think, as he puts it, that wasn't a very nice thing to do. So, what I see is, and I'm thinking of, you had mentioned you get quotes from the Bible a lot, and I've already written a chapter for a book called Atheist Voices of Minnesota that begins to make these connections. And, I don't want to make the comparison too lightly, because I think one cause is just and another isn't, but what I see occurring is people selectively choose from the Bible or any other religious text, the Quran, to look really ardently and with passion, and they mean it, and I respect that, but I'm still writing they look for some proof that their God cares about animals. And what you find, and again, my main focus is Christianity, because that's the most widespread, has the most influence, is that there isn't. There's maybe some admonitions against overt cruelty just for the sake of being cruel, but there is, reading books saying Jesus was vegan, even though he ate fish. I don't know how that works. But really this desperate sense, like, I think, and the subtitle of my book is Remaking the Procrustean Bed. People might know the Greek story of Procrustes. In Greek mythology, which was once a religion, people believe this, which we now look at as myth. And Procrustes was a thief and a killer who would welcome people into his inn, and if they didn't fit on his bed, he would stretch them out till their limbs came off, and if they were too long, he would chop them up until they fit on his bed. And my argument is that religion, and other people have used this analogy, I haven't made it up, in different ways, is that religion and animal liberation is a Procrustean bed. You're going to have to stretch the truth or chop a lot of things off to ever make a good argument. And I don't think I've read a lot to write this book, and I haven't seen one that actually works.
Karen Davis uses the Procrustean.
Yeah, in a different analogy,
different way,
yeah,
but yeah.
it's a good analogy. Yes.
Kim, can you talk briefly about your other chapter? I've never utilized the term Holocaust in the context of animal rights, but in the past, and I've refrained from doing it since, but in the past I have used the verbs to enslave or to rape. Do you see those terms productive in any context?
Yes, I do, and that'll. Somebody I spoke with at the Critical Animal Studies Conference is an activist who everybody should know about, named Dallas Rising. She's been in the movement for like 15 years. She's from Minneapolis, and she wrote a chapter for Defiant Daughters, which is which I'm in as well. It's a retrospective on Carol Adams' work. So I know Carol Adams is not the most popular figure for other reasons. There's always controversies. And she writes, her chapter is called Happy Meat, Happy Rape. And this is okay, because this isn't a chapter. I'm not revealing personal information about Dallas. She talks about being raped, but not in a dark alley with a knife to her throat, in what others might even say, well, that's not rape. You went to the person's house willingly. And she makes that analogy between what happens to, especially female non-humans. They are, the term used in the industry, they're called rape racks. I mean, that's what industry users call them. You can't naturally, let's say cows have been so genetically modified that they can't naturally reproduce with bulls, so they have to be artificially inseminated at this point, and there's a good argument that that is a form of rape. And what I finally conclude is that these analogies work if you actually had that experience where you have felt it, which is why I critique PETA. So they'll use let's say a Native American analogy. And what happens is, the Native American genocide, you take this rich culture, as was mentioned at the beginning, that were on native land, and you make their whole history about a genocide that occurred, where they were, almost wiped out to extinction by Europeans. So you're borrowing on their pain and their slaughter without really caring. I mean, I don't know if anybody would disagree, but PETA has shown no sense that they care about Native Americans. One thing I argue in the book is, even if you have to force yourself, which you shouldn't, try volunteering some of your time to groups from which you're willing to borrow your analogies. So, for example, there's a Vegans of Color website. There are Isaac Bashevis Singer, who, Jewish American writer who's now deceased, wrote in his novel Enemies, a Love Story, that, I'm paraphrasing, that for animals, all humans are Nazis. For them, it's an eternal Treblinka, which is a name of, I don't want to say James, I always want to say James Patterson, but it's Charles Patterson's book called Eternal Treblinka, where Singer lived through the Holocaust, had family so he felt that connection, he can make it. So I think these analogies can work, but not simply to borrow them for what you think is an important issue now. Only if you have a connection and you feel that they're real for you. Otherwise, I think it continues to be part of the problem. Not that I don't slip every now and then, and I don't really use genocide or Holocaust, but sometimes the word slavery, it's hard not to, because in a way animals are...
You can say like to confine instead of to enslave, but that does change the meaning in different contexts.
And the thing is, just by definition, non-humans are slaves. But just to say that without contextualizing is to ignore a history of slavery in America, which is also, if you do read the book, Patrice Jones, who people might be familiar with, has some. It's an interesting afterword where she's actually in combat with some of the people who are writing in the book. She and I know Sarah Jane, I've started to see things differently, are very much against the term abolitionism because of that racial history. So to use these terms without acknowledging that there's another history there, I think is problematic.
Do we have one more question?
I saw two hands. I'll let you.
How about for someone that didn't get to ask a question?
In regards to, I feel like I've spoken to a lot of welfarist folks in the animal rights movement, and their approach I feel like is a lot different. And I feel like the way they justify the things they do or say, or maybe not even having a capitalist critique, is because, in the words that you mentioned, I feel like the way they look at it is veganism is saving the world. So if you can make vegans, no matter what, like at any cost, you are saving animals. And I think that's the way that a lot of welfarist folks look at it. And I think what they're trying to do is just to be as effective as possible. Mm-hmm. Which, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've come across that a lot. And I don't know how I feel about it. But I definitely, I feel like, I don't know, that's something I'm just throwing out there. But I've definitely come across that a lot, where people are trying to be effective, trying to, I feel like even like catering their outreach to people who are more likely to go vegan, and possibly ignoring other demographics that would not be as likely to go vegan, because the more people go vegan, you'll be saving 100 animals a year, so this many animals are being saved.
which may be in itself a very capitalist way of looking at it. But yeah, just throwing it out there.
No, that's a really good point, and I mean I understand the welfare to abolition approach. I mean there are some people, I don't think you're referring to people who say yes, animals aren't as important. Let's just make things less bad. There are people who say we work for welfare to get to abolition, and I do understand it. I think good cases could be made. I just don't think. I mean, I for reasons I touched on and I explain a little more. I'm not saying I've written the final word, of course. I explain why I think it doesn't work that way. I think it's going to result in people feeling better about eating animal products. And something you might be referring to, a lot of the major groups, even PETA, give out vegetarian starter kits, even though they're vegan starter kits, but like they won't even use the word vegan because it's considered too extreme. So I'm not insensitive, and I used to be more. Like I said, when this book, it's amazing how much things can change in 3 years. It took 3 years to write this book. It started out as like, abolition man, and we're gonna take that word back from Gary Francione. And then it just, it morphed into something different. And it's kind of like, I think the attitude you're mentioning as well also doesn't, like, let's make vegans at any cost. But I think veganism really comes with the transformation of how you view the world. Some people might go vegan for health reasons, which is good, but they still might, I don't know, go to circuses and zoos and wear fur. And I'm interested in this idea of viewing animals differently. Viewing animals as being just as worthy, just as willing to enjoy their lives, or just as capable and should be as able to enjoy their lives as we are. Just one other thing, I was at a conference recently, and a very I thought this person was well known, but no one's heard of him, so maybe he's not that well known. A scholar really made horrible statements about animal rights activists, how we think we're heroes, when I'm like, it's the opposite. You could spend 5 hours leafleting, 2 hours actually rescuing animals, and at the end of this day still cry yourself to sleep feeling like you haven't done enough. 150 billion land-dwelling animals die per year, and more are going to die next year. And also had this idea that, vegans have this idea that, the wilderness and in the wild, animals just run free and they skip through the glade, and, that's all we want to happen. And that's I think, a false idea, too. I think it was Tennyson, because, again, the English degree, who said, nature is red in tooth and claw. But there's this idea of... rather having animals, be free to die in a way that is more natural to their being. I'm not. Another person I quote, who I'm not a big fan of, is Lear Keith. Who wrote The Vegetarian Myth, and it's a really bad book, but I think you should read it if you could get a free copy. She writes about. Some random vegan discussion board where someone's saying we should fence off the Serengeti so lions can't kill gazelles, so no animal should ever have to die. And I'm like, what vegan do you know is that naive or thinks that way? It's the same argument against freeing when if you liberate, let's say, mink from a mink farm, and knowing that they might die in the wild, they might not be able to survive in whatever environment. Let's say Minnesota. I don't know a lot about mink and if they could survive if you free mink in Minnesota. But there's this sense of rather die free, die in the wild, as opposed to dying at the hands of humans. So I think it's kind of all these ideas that go missing when it just becomes, let's just make more vegans. Let's just kind of keep, and that was the argument during the childbearing debate. Let's just give birth to a lot of vegans, as if you can ever decide, like you can control if your child is going to be vegan. These kind of inane ideas. So I think there was one more.
It's just a really quick question. What are your thoughts on vegans who stomp out bugs very willingly and kind of?
Well, I mean, I personally have a bug catcher in my house, and the vegans I know don't kill bugs, but I've been in a position where if I see a bug on me, my first reaction, I don't mean it, is to, like, I was in a hotel room like a few weeks ago and I tried to not kill a bug and I wound up killing the bug. That's not the only time that's happened, where in my efforts to maybe be that hero, you know, this person said we all think we are, it winds up happening. And I think that my attitude has changed. I really have a problem. I don't like, I have a guttural reaction to bugs, but I don't kill them if I can avoid it. Sometimes I don't even want to look at them, which is my problem. But they have a right to live, so I just bring them outside.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. Thank all of you.